Hi, welcome to JRB Conversations. I'm Abe Socher. I'm the editor of the Jewish Review of Books, and today we'll be speaking with Benjamin Baylant. Ben is the author of two extraordinary and very bookish recent books. The first, which won the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, is Kafka's Last Trial: The Case of a Literary Legacy. And that's about the long, complicated legal battle over Kafka's manuscripts, which eventually reached the Israeli Supreme Court 4 years ago. The second book, written with Meirav Mack, and which has terrific images from the great photographer Frederick Brenner, is Jerusalem, City of Books, which takes the reader on really a kind of tour of the great and often unknown or hidden book collections and libraries of Jerusalem where Baylant lives. By the way, Ben and I will share just a few of those pictures in the course of our conversation where it makes sense.
Hello, Abe. Thank you for
Hi,
having me on.
thanks for coming. Um, I should say, by the way, it's a gray, rainy day over here in the Midwest. It feels a little bit proggish. Um, how's the weather in Jerusalem?
Distinctly un-Kafkaesque,
Bright and
bright,
sunny.
clear.
When did you first read Kafka? 10th grade, Metamorphosis?
Yeah, like everyone else, I think in high school, The Metamorphosis, The Hunger Artist, some of his parables. And then on his own, I found an old copy of his on my own, I felt an old copy of his diaries, and that intrigued me to get to know the man behind these strange and sometimes uninterpretable parables.
So were you reading him all these years before you started this book or here and
Yeah,
there?
I mean, he started a fascination on me long before I ever heard of this particular trial over his manuscripts. The first time I heard of that trial, I was actually doing an German-Israeli exchange program, and I was sent to Die Zeit newspaper in Hamburg, and the colleagues there were already talking about the intermediate stages of this trial before it hit the Supreme Court, and already then I became intrigued about the larger questions that this trial was opening up.
And did you realize you wanted to write about it right away, or you
Yeah,
just reading it and
I
decide
wanted
in the
to
Times
write
and
something about it. But the whole thing, to be honest, didn't really click until I actually sat in the Supreme Court chambers and listened to the arguments and got to know one of the protagonists, Eva Hoffe, who one of my friends refers to as the widow of Kafka's ghost.
which doesn't sound fun. How did you meet her at first? How did you meet Eva Hoffa? And who is she?
Eva Hoffe, and maybe this could be our first photograph that we can display, was born in Prague and came just before the war with her family at the age of 5. And the
There she
fact,
is.
yeah, there she is. She's standing at the graveside of Max Brod in Trumpeldor Cemetery in Tel Aviv. And this is more or less the age that she was when I came to know her. And to fill in a little bit of background, perhaps, of the story, um, her mother was the most intimate friend of Max Brod, and Max Brod was the closest friend of Franz Kafka.
Ah,
And in a sense, the manuscripts, the actual physical manuscripts that were at the center of this court case in Jerusalem, I thought sort of, in a sense, tied together all these characters, right? They tied together first Kafka and Brod, because of course the whole story begins with the death of Kafka in 1924, where he famously instructs Max Brod to burn all of his manuscripts unread. And I always thought that that was maybe characteristic of Kafka's genius, that he asked the very person least likely to be able to carry out this instruction.
and
He
and
was
by the way,
able to
uh,
give the instruction and know that that's fulfilled. Max Brod, instead of all these manuscripts, did exactly the opposite and dedicated the rest of his life to making Kafka the figure that we
And by the way, we're there. You slowed down there for a minute, so I hope the connection is okay. Um, so Kafka is, well, tell us how they met, and is Kafka and how Kafka told him to burn the manuscripts, whether he told him more than once. And I mean, I should say, as you know, lots of writers say this. Um, do they always mean it? Clearly not. Some of them do. Some of them do burn their manuscripts themselves. Did Kafka mean it?
I think the moral of the story is if you want your manuscripts or your diaries or any personal effects destroyed, you better do it yourself. Um, but back to the first part of your question, Kafka and Broad met as university students, and in a sense, they were completely opposite temperaments. I mean, Max Brod was very outgoing. He was always trying to drag Kafka, for example, to Zionist meetings. Sometimes he succeeded. He succeeded in dragging Kafka to a series of lectures that Martin Buber gave in Prague, for example. But also, more importantly, Max Brod had no trouble in publishing, so he published something more than 70 books in his lifetime. Many of them were very early novels. And Kafka, of course, had the opposite inclination. And so coming to the end of Kafka's...
You've got these best friends. Broad is, would you say mediocre or more than mediocre?
I would say that I actually like a lot of his writing. I mean, which ranges from the novelistic to, he wrote plays. He wrote the libretto to the first ever opera in Hebrew. He wrote poetry. I would say, I wouldn't use the word mediocre. I would say that he bore the burden of knowing that his closest friend was a writer of genius and that he was not. And the selflessness of Max Brod really, I think, comes through his story. I mean, it's not easy to know that you're a writer of some repute. He was winning awards, Max Brod was, and yet his best friend was a writer virtually unrecognized, but a writer that Max Brod himself knew had attained some kind of genius. And yet to, in a sense, put oneself under Kafka's shadow, that's what Max Brod, in essence, did. And that also, I think, plays a part in his decision to rescue, in a sense, Kafka's works. And I should add that rescue had various dimensions to it. So he rescued those manuscripts physically.
Now, Kafka had published some of the things that we're all familiar with. He had published Metamorphosis and I don't know how many other things, but none of the novels?
None of the 3 novels were published in his lifetime. Each of them was finished by Max Brod. And I'll say not just finished, but you're an editor. Max Brod was the editor of Kafka, and sometimes a heavy-handed one. So Kafka, for example, left his novel, The Trial, in unordered chapters. The chapters, as we have them today, are in the sequence that Max Brod put them in. And he took out certain references, but no, you're absolutely right. I mean, Kafka did publish short stories during his lifetime, but all of the novels were completed by Brod. But this rescue, was rescuing Kafka's manuscripts and legacy from himself, from Kafka's own wishes, his last instructions. Then, after Kafka died, Max Brod rescued his reputation. He wrote the first biography of Kafka in 1937. He then rescued the physical papers when Brod himself fled from Prague to Tel Aviv in 1938. And so this is it's a complicated rescue, but it's a rescue that has its origin in also an act of betrayal.
So how does Eva Hoffa get the manuscripts?
Right. So then, to accelerate the timeline a little bit, Max Brod comes with a single suitcase to Tel Aviv. And that suitcase is filled with not his own manuscripts, which arrived later, but with Kafka's manuscripts. I think he knew the value of those manuscripts. And of course, in Tel Aviv, he needed help to edit this voluminous material. And to do that, he hired his closest friend, Eva Hofe, a fellow Prague refugee, and they sat a couple days a week at his apartment in Abarbanel Street. She was living with her daughters on Spinoza Street, and they edited and published the Kafka that we know today. So at a certain point, Max Brod, like Kafka, never had children. So in his will in the 1960s, he wrote to instruct that all of his own archive and his estate, including all the priceless Kafka material, should go to Eva Hofe. And then after Max Brod dies in Tel Aviv in 1968, Eva does what she never dared to do during Max Brod's lifetime. She begins to sell things. She goes most famously to Sotheby's in London and sells the original manuscript of the novel, The Trial, and it goes for more than $1 million. And she, in turn, lives the ripe old age of 101 in Tel Aviv, and she dies in 2007, and she gives all of this to her daughters, Ruth and Eva Hofe, and that's where really the court case begins.
Okay, so so who are the parties to this case?
So it's very interesting because it very quickly became a triangular international case. The purchaser of that manuscript, The Trial, from Eva Hofe back in the 80s was the Marbach Archive, which is the most prestigious archive of German literature in the world, and sort of as a state institution, and more or less the equivalent in Germany of what the National Library is in Jerusalem. And so Eva had signaled, both Eva and her mother had signaled their willingness to sell all of the rest of Kafka's manuscripts to Marbach on the death of Esther. And at that point, the National Library of Israel steps in just 24 hours before the probate of the will of Esther Hofe and says, wait. This is not a will that should be executed. The Kafka material should belong as a cultural treasure of the Jewish people, should belong in the National Library, neither to private hands nor to the German archive. So it became very quickly basically a case with three interested parties. There was the National Library representing Israel, Marbach representing German literature, and Eva, her sister had died in the meantime, who bore the burden of essentially claiming that this was personal property and that this was an attempt at state appropriation of her own private property.
And did they want to buy it, or was it just nationalize it and now it belongs to the Jewish National Library?
Yeah, the case was constructed such that if Marbach and Eva Hofe won, then she would have the right to sell the material to Germany. But if the National Library won, then it would have the right to all this material without compensating Eva at all.
Wow, so it's an all or nothing. And okay, so so we have the two positions, although you could fill them out a little if you think we should, but you've got Eva, she inherited this from her mother. Her mother received it from Brod, who was very close to her. And you've got the Jewish National Library saying these are treasures of the Jewish people, and as such they shouldn't leave, and they belong here, not in your safe deposit box, Eva, and not at Marbach. So what's Marbach's position?
It became very quickly more than just an interpretation of Max Brod's will, and more than a court case, as it started off as a court case of being a family court. But it came, and I noticed this the moment I sat in the Supreme Court, that it became about some more fundamental questions. That is to say, it became about how do we interpret Kafka, right? So on the one hand, the Israeli position was essentially Kafka is a Jewish writer first and foremost, and belongs here in Jerusalem. The German position is that Kafka, of course, wrote in German. He may never have been a citizen of Germany. He only lived there very, very briefly at the end of his life. But he's part of the modern, he's not just part, he is a centerpiece of the modern German canon, and therefore belongs belongs here. They also made sort of more condescending arguments, such that, you know, we in Germany, we have the experts to deal with this material, and the National Library in Jerusalem is under-equipped in this sense. So that was sort of how these fundamental questions, really about what kind of about cultural belonging, really.
And was Broad's will, was it clear?
It wasn't clear. Broad was a better writer of novels than he was of wills. And his will was, in essence, contradictory, because he says, on the one hand, in one clause, I give everything to you, Esther Hoffe, to do with as you wish. But in another clause, he says that I also instruct you, but that before you, Esther, pass away, that you would arrange for the proper deposit of this priceless material in an archive, such as, now I'm quoting, the National Library of Israel, the Tel Aviv Municipal Library, or another archive here or abroad. So he left that clause quite vague, and that's the beginning of the problem.
A question from a reader. Shouldn't citizenship or Israeli citizenship or lack thereof be a central issue? I suppose that is Broad citizen. I assume Broad was an Israeli citizen, as were the Hoffas. Is that relevant?
That's why jurisdictionally this was here. That's right. So Broad was an Israeli citizen, and both Esther and Eva Hoffe were Israeli citizens. But it's more than just a technical issue. I would reply to that question that it raises also something more fundamental, which is the fact that it's no coincidence that these papers came to reside in Israel. It's no coincidence, because Max Brod was desperate to get out of Prague before the arrival of the Wehrmacht. He did so on the very last day, actually, that the Czech-Polish border was open. And he was desperate to get out. He did not gain admittance to the US. He could not go to any other country. So the very fact that, in a sense, he was the victim of what he uses this phrase, the bestialization of politics. And being a victim of that kind of bestialization, he found refuge precisely here. So it's not just an accident, let's say, that the material was here and that Brod became an Israeli citizen.
And did Marbach, did the representatives of Marbach, did they address that at all? That there's a certain irony in insisting upon the manuscripts of a writer who, after all, his three sisters all died in the camps. His best friend, as you say, escapes Prague and Nazi bestiality. Do they address that, or is that just sort of in the background?
Yeah, so it was quite clear from their position that they would stress the fact that Kafka never stepped foot in Israel. He died in 1924 before there was a state. What's his connection with this place, right? From the German perspective, there is no connection. From the German perspective, the language, the linguistic element is the defining connection.
You have a great image, which perhaps we can get up. Kafka did study Hebrew, correct?
That's right.
Let's see if we can get that up there. Tell us about this notebook, which I assume is one of the disputed documents, and how it came about.
This is a marvelous document that is Kafka's Hebrew exercise notebook. And if you can see clearly enough on your screens, you'll see that the right-hand column is in each case Hebrew words, and the left are the German translations. And at the end of his life, Kafka studied Hebrew very intensively, actually with a student who came from Jerusalem to Prague. He also studied with his last lover, Dora Diamant. I'll add parenthetically that I know that joining us today is the author of a wonderful book about Dora Diamant and the relationship with Kafka, called Kafka's Last Love. The author's name is Kathy Diamant. And he and Dora actually played and toyed, Dora reports, because she survived, played with actually coming to Tel Aviv. And the idea was that Kafka was they were going to open up a cafe in Tel Aviv, and Kafka was going to be the waiter and Dora was going to be the short order cook. And actually one of the words on that page that we just saw is the word meltzar, the word for waiter. But he was also reading Hebrew literature and some of the new finds of the new material that's only now actually coming to light are, for example, a letter where he writes to his Hebrew teacher to excuse himself, to beg forgiveness for not having done his homework that week. And he says, the last line of that letter is, please don't be angry. And he's speaking to a 19, 20-year-old. And he's saying, please don't be angry with me. I'm angry enough for the two of us. So he was extremely invested in learning Hebrew, but I'll say one more thing, which is that he was also intensively interested in the Yiddish language. Kafka gave only one public talk in his lifetime, and it was about the relationship between Yiddish and German. And he wanted to reverse the usual German condescension toward Yiddish. He was fascinated with Yiddish theater. He writes about 100 pages in his diaries about attending Yiddish plays. So there's really two separate questions, which is his relationship to Jewish languages and his relationship to Jewishness per se, which is a more ambivalent relationship.
But as long as you mentioned Dora Diamant, Deborah Pantoni asks, and I didn't know anything about this, what is happening to the search for the papers Dora Diamant kept after Kafka died and that were absconded with by the Nazis?
I think that the last I spoke with Kathy Diamant, who's on the trail, that all hope has not been lost, which reminds me of another line that Kafka said to Max Brod, who remarked on the alleged hopelessness and bleakness of Kafka's work. And Kafka wanted to reassure him. And he said, oh, Max, of course there's hope. There's even infinite hope, just not for us. But the story is that quite apart from the material that ended up with Max Brod, there were notebooks that Kafka left in the apartment of Dora Diamant, which was raided by the Gestapo. Probably that material ended up in Gestapo archives, which was then taken over by Red Army archives. And the best guess is that some of this Kafka material is to this day residing in a mislabeled box in Moscow.
Wow, wow. All right, so back to the court case, I think. So it wends its way through Tel Aviv probate court or whatever, and the next court, and it gets to the Israeli Supreme Court. What happens there?
What happens is that these arguments come to the fore, and what happens is that the assumption that the National Library of Israel makes comes really out quite cleanly for the first time. And that assumption is very interesting, to my mind at least, which is that we don't disagree with the position that Kafka is a diasporic writer. In fact, maybe he's the most diasporic writer of all modern Jewish writers. And yet, there's some assumption being made in that courtroom that day that Jerusalem is the natural and proper culmination of a story that began elsewhere, which is to say that cultural products of the diaspora belong somehow in Jerusalem. And that was a very powerful argument that was made that day.
It's a kind of classic Zionist argument.
In other words, we can speak not just of ingathering of people, but we can speak of cultural ingathering, and that includes material culture. And I'll add one more thing, which is shortly after the trial, I went to Marbach and I interviewed the director of the archive who had overseen the German side of this. And we were talking about why it matters in today's age of digitalization, where an archive such as Kafka's ends up physically speaking, right? Geographically speaking. And he made a very interesting point, which I'll paraphrase. He said, well, in this case, it does matter, because if Kafka's estate ends up in Jerusalem, then Kafka will be read as a narrowly Jewish writer. Whereas if we win the case, this was before the verdict, I should add, if we win the case and Kafka ends up in Germany, then Kafka will be read in the most universal sense as a representative of European culture. And I thought that that was an amazing assumption in and of itself. So here you have two dueling assumptions: the Israeli assumption about the Jerusalem acting as a kind of center of gravity for diaspora culture, and the German position that we, and this is not so long after the Shoah, we somehow represent universal culture as such. It's the Israelis who have particularist interests, and we Germans, if we have interests at all, it's only the interests of literature per se.
Which is the opposite of the argument that, well, he wrote in German, so they belong here.
Right.
By the way, did the Czechs ever get involved? Does the Czech Republic have a claim?
The Czech Republic wasn't recognized as a party to this dispute. I don't think it even sought to. There's not really an important archive of Kafka, and here too you see the dominant influence of language, because of course Kafka had to be translated himself into Czech, and so if you go to Prague today, you'll find a lot of Kafka kitsch, but not a lot of Kafka manuscripts.
So now let's talk about the decision and if we can be so crude, whether it was fair.
This is the spoiler alert, huh?
Yeah.
In 2016, the panel of 3 judges unanimously of the Supreme Court unanimously agreed with the decision written by the Justice Eliakim Rubinstein that this material should all go to the National Library, where it will be digitized and eventually made public. And that's in fact what happened. It took some time because part of the material was in a bank vault in Tel Aviv. That was the first to arrive. I was actually there on the day that they opened the boxes for the first time. The second part took some time because Eva Hoffe died not long after losing this trial, and I should say that she was in great despair. And after she died, a team from the National Library went to retrieve the manuscripts that were in her apartment that she shared with a lot of cats on Spinoza Street. And the third and final batch was actually in a bank where Broad and Esther Hoffe had deposited some of the more valuable material. And there was a whole secondary case about how to get a Swiss bank to give up material to the jurisdiction of the Israeli courts.
How many papers altogether?
Oh, thousands and thousands of papers. I mean, the bulk actually is Max Broad's own material, and that's really important and in and of itself. But really, it's still being poured over really as we speak. There's new discoveries of correspondence. There's new discoveries that I've seen of Kafka's drawings. You know, he liked to sketch. There is Max Broad's diaries going all the way back that tell the full story of his friendship with Kafka that have never been seen. So there's really interesting stuff in there.
And you got to know Eva well during this process. Do you think she was treated fairly? Do you think there was there could have been a fair decision? She gets nothing. I assume she's heir to the money that her mother got when she sold the trial and whatever else she sold. But after all, she's a kind of granddaughter of sorts, or a goddaughter of Broad, who saved everything. She preserved it, albeit probably at least the stuff on Spinoza Street. That's probably not the best way to save precious manuscripts. Should she have been compensated?
I think she should have been in some way. I think she was treated unfairly. I found she was much maligned in the press as being sort of a greedy, eccentric cat lady. I found her to be a very sympathetic and very intelligent figure. I'll just tell you one anecdote that I met her usually at her favorite cafe on Dubnov Street in Tel Aviv. And the first time that we met after she lost, I walked into the cafe and I didn't see her. And I was worried that she had stood me up or something bad had happened. And then I went back out to the terrace and she was sitting there, but she had shaved off her hair. And I didn't ask, but I took it as a gesture of mourning, actually.
Uh-huh.
That's the kind of despair. And then she once mentioned to me in a phone conversation, apropos of nothing, she mentioned the fate of the Austrian writer Ingeborg Bachmann, who was smoking in bed, and there was a conflagration, and Bachmann died shortly thereafter. And I hung up the phone, and I thought, this is a very strange thing to bring up. We've never talked about Bachmann before. And then I had this sort of nightmare that, having lost the case, Eva Hoffe would go home to her apartment on Spinoza Street and, sort of in a kind of terrible auto da fe, kind of burn all of the manuscripts as a statement of saying, sort of, you know, if I can't have them, no one can. And that would be her. If I were writing a novel, I might end it that way.
So did you do anything?
I didn't. I talked to one of her friends, actually. She had two very close friends who accompanied her during the trial. I told them about that. But yeah, she was in deep despair over this.
Um, well, there's so much more to say, and I'll save the other questions that I see are already up there for the end. But we should. You were writing another book while you were writing this book, um, and this other book, Jerusalem, the City of the Book, is about the unique libraries and manuscript collections in Jerusalem. How did that come about, and what prompted you to write that book or to co-write that book, since Merav Mack wrote that book with you?
Yeah, in essence, I mean, there's some overlap between the two books in the sense of Jerusalem seeing itself as the center of gravity, right? Um, and I was talking with Merav, who can open doors in Jerusalem like no one else, by the way. And she had spent years doing a survey of Jerusalem's libraries, Christian, Jewish, and Islamic. And we were having a conversation one day, and I said, look, this is more than just about the holdings of these particular libraries, world class though they may be. This is actually a way of telling the story of the communities here, the diverse communities, all the strange cross-hatched encounters that you have in this city. And maybe this is a way of telling of portraying Jerusalem in a new way, which is to say, not chronologically, not as a series of conquests, but precisely as a kind of palimpsest of different textual layers, not archaeological layers, but textual layers. And I said, look, if you have strolled Jerusalem, you know very well that you don't experience it chronologically. In fact, you experience a whole jumble of juxtapositions and you leap from one era to the other. And in a sense, that's what we wanted to do with this book, is to take the reader on a kind of stroll of some of these more obscure corners of Jerusalem with the idea of portraying the communities and how the communities relate to their own literary heritage, which is to say, a lot of these libraries are completely inaccessible. So this is not a library like you would find in North America, where the librarian wants to democratize knowledge and open access and, yes, how can I help you? No, we never once got a "how can I help you" from the gatekeepers of Jerusalem's libraries. In fact, it took us 2 years to negotiate a visit to the Greek Orthodox Manuscript Library, to the Armenian Library, to the Al-Aqsa Manuscript Library, etc. In one case, Merav actually had to fly to Addis for a single day to get permission from the Ethiopian Orthodox Patriarch, written permission to instruct the local Ethiopian community to let us into their library. So this was a way of seeing, well, how does material culture anchor each of these communities? And these communities are all rivals with one another, right? So each of which is pointing to its library and saying, oh, we have a continuous literary heritage that goes back to the 8th century, right? In other words, it's a way of proving one's continuity and one's attachment to the city.
What are some of the amazing things you saw in those three libraries, the ones you just mentioned?
Well, the one thing that we found in all three, by the way, and in almost every of Jerusalem languages, was some version of the Psalms, actually. We saw it in Coptic, in Ge'ez, in Arabic, in Latin, in Armenian, and of course, in Hebrew. So there was some sort of commonality there. But you know, the Greek library, and here's just another anecdote, right, on the question of rivalry. the Greeks initially said to us, no, you can't have access. And the reason that the patriarch Theophilus gave was Uspensky. So we leave the audience, and I turned to Merav and I said, what's Uspensky? Is this something that and she said, oh, Uspensky was a 19th century bibliophile, book scholar, and book thief who stole some of the most important manuscripts from the Greek Orthodox. And I said, this is like how time works in Jerusalem, that a 19th century theft could be invoked as if it were yesterday to prevent, two researchers in this century from coming in. So yeah, it's just that's what the gatekeepers of Jerusalem are like.
And you've mentioned now Islamic collection and two Christian collections. How about this interesting Hasidic collection that you both did and did not, as it were, see?
Well, one day, Merav and Frederic Brenner, who did the masterful photographs for this book, a couple of which we have tonight, but only a fraction of which, we found out that the Karliner Rebbe, who was rebuilding the most important pre-war Hasidic library in the world, has like once a week he holds court and he has an audience, and it's kind of like a psychoanalyst office. There's a waiting room, and then you go in for 5 minutes, and then this guy comes out and, okay, now it's our turn, and we were warned that we had to be very concise with the Rebbe, and it might only be a 2 or 3 minute audience. In the end, we were there for 45 minutes, and we learned that astonishingly, the Karliner Rebbe is the only person who's allowed in the Karliner library. Even the librarian, who we also interviewed, Rabbi Schwartz, who actually collects manuscripts and tries to reconstruct this pre-war Hasidic library, even he has never been in there. Instead, what they do is they digitize all their acquisitions immediately. They have a partnership with the the National Library, and everything is online. So what the Rebbe said to us is why would you want to visit the library to begin with? It's all online. It's all digitized. You can see everything that you wanted. So that's the one library in which we have no photograph of the space.
Now, among the things that we're still, I happen to know this because Yitzhak Melamed, Professor Yitzhak Melamed, a few years back, wrote an article for us about that the lost collection, the lost library. It was loaded on trucks by the Nazis and never seen again. That included, if I remember correctly, did it include the Baal Shem Tov's copy of the Zohar, exactly, and autograph manuscripts and so on, all of which still may exist somewhere, perhaps again in a mislabeled box in Russia. But what do they have now?
Well, they also send out kind of emissaries all over the world to auctions, and they actually once in a while they come across a manuscript with the stamp of the original Karliner pre-war library. So they have some of that material, but they also just they have the most important Hasidic texts from the Baal Shem Tov all the way down.
Wow. You mentioned we have a couple of these images from the great Frederic Brenner, and early on you were talking about the juxtaposition of different communities and different libraries, and so one thing you were telling me just the last time we spoke was that that you found these two extraordinary neighbors, a Jew and a Syriac Christian, both great scholars, who had never didn't know each other, let alone know that they were actually reading texts in essentially the same language, that is Aramaic. Perhaps we could see those pictures and you could tell us a little bit about them.
This is a photograph of our visit to the private library in the old city of Jerusalem of Daniel Sperber, who's an Israel Prize-winning scholar, who's the world expert on Minhagei Israel, on customary law, you might say, who's an expert also, as he showed us on this particular day, the world's expert in the Greek loan words in the Talmud. The Talmud, of course, uses a lot of Greek words, and he compiles all of them and studies how they came to the Talmud. And he spends his life in Aramaic. And we went to the rooftop. His library is sort of, it's actually in an old Beit Midrash. And we went to the rooftop and realized something extraordinary, which is that you could almost literally leap from the roof of his library to the adjacent library, which Merav and I had visited some weeks prior. And that's the library of the Syriac Christian community, which is the oldest Christian community in, we'll get back to that in a moment, but this is the librarian Abuna Shimon he's a Syriac monk, grew up in southeastern Turkey and holds extremely precious Syriac heritage. So basically Syriac as a dialect of Aramaic, Aramaic being of course the lingua franca of the ancient Middle East for both Christians and Jews. And we met both of these people within weeks. They live within a stone's throw of one another, and yet they had never met. And this really brought home sort of the density, first of all, of culture in Jerusalem, but also we had this dream of bringing such figures together for the first time, introducing them. I have a feeling that their passion for Jerusalem and their passion for the written word would spark quite a conversation.
And the one the picture that we just flipped past, whose collection was that in? That was it? It's a map.
This is a map from Rabbi Sperber's library, from a atlas that was published in 1575 in Cologne. And it's a view of Jerusalem from the east. So imagine that you're standing on the Mount of Olives. And Sperber mentioned to us that in the introduction to the atlas, the editor says, well, the reason for these 5 figures in Oriental dress in the foreground is so that the authors of this atlas didn't want the Turks to gain any military kind of knowledge of Jerusalem from their very accurate maps, or at least accurate for the 16th century. And therefore, on the assumption that Turks, as good Muslims, would not be able to, would be forbidden from looking at an image of the human form, they kind of gratuitously put the human forms right in the forefront of the image.
These 5 guys.
Nice small manuscript from Sperber's collection.
Nice. Perhaps the National Library, perhaps in our conversation, has not gotten the best of it in our discussion of Kafka, but they have much else. What else does the National Library have? Did you go there?
Oh yeah, many times. I mean, most famously, they have the library of Gershom Scholem. I mean, you could write a whole book just on the Yekiz libraries of Rehavia, and they've kept that intact. And you can go in and look at, which Scholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah, was annotating. The library, I mean, it's really endless. I mean, the archives of the library, besides Kafka, and this came up in the Kafka case, also have the estates of many of the German Jewish thinkers. So Martin Buber is there, Hugo Bergman, who was also a friend of Kafka. His estate is there. I mean, it's really endless. The Persian collection, the Islamic collection. It's and of course, they're building the new library as we speak. I was just by there the other day, and there was this is something else that connects the 2 books. There was some talk by the Germans during the Kafka case. Oh, almost every town and village in Germany has at least one Kafka street. That's how important he is to us. Whereas in Israel, there's not a single Kafka street, which happened to have been true. And the response from one immigrant from Prague to Jerusalem named Otto Dov Kulka, a survivor and a brilliant writer, whom also I've met several times, he actively petitioned the street naming committee of the municipality of Jerusalem to rename the new square in front of the new National Library, whenever it's finished, let's say in 2 or 3 years, as Kikar Kafka, Kafka Square. We'll see if that actually is taken.
Nice. And I suppose just to reach back when you said Martin Buber's papers there are there, and others who are friends of Kafka or people he knew or read. I suppose the same sort of so it's the same sort of argument that Marbach made could be made in the reverse. You could say, no, this is the center for, without even making the Zionist argument, this is the center for, the study of those distinctive German-speaking Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century, people like Shlomo Hugo Bergman and so on and so forth. Before
That's
we get
exactly it, which is why I'll just interject once more and say that for that very reason, the judges in Jerusalem were more than just judges in this case. They really had unwittingly to serve as gatekeepers of Kafka interpretation. And if you read the verdicts of each of the 3 stages of this trial, they read almost like literary documents, and I tried to read them as such. And they have to pronounce exactly on the question that you just raised, right? Should Kafka belong by virtue of the language, to German literature, or by virtue, or to these other friends? And then you have to think from Kafka's own perspective. He would have been, I think, very amused by the trial, about everyone taking such a proprietary attitude to someone who himself kind of was very ambivalent about belonging. He would have supposed to have, where would he like who would he like his neighbor to be, Bergman and Buber in Jerusalem, or would he like his neighbors to be Heidegger in Marbach?
I choose Bergman and Buber, by the way, over Heidegger. Before we go to just at least a couple of questions, you tantalizingly mentioned the El-Aqsa library or collection at the very beginning. What's that like?
We got permission from the Waqf, which is the endowment that runs the Har HaBayit these days, to get permission to several of its libraries. There are more than one library on the Temple Mount. One is a UNESCO-funded manuscript restoration library, which is just steps from the Dome of the Rock. And we have some of Frederick's photos of that, where they're basically painstakingly restoring page by page medieval Islamic manuscripts, including those by Al-Ghazali when we were there. And then there's even more intriguingly a library underneath Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Wow.
And this is very rare to get
so
permission.
beneath the Temple Mount, beneath Har HaBayit.
Beneath Har HaBayit. And in essence, if you stand and you're facing Al-Aqsa Mosque, so you're facing south, there's steps that go beneath it and lead to the original Herodian corridor from Beit Sheni, from the Second Temple period, that originally led from the gates of the southern wall up onto the plaza of the Temple Mount itself, and that exists as it did really. And at the very back of that corridor is a library, which is completely unremarkable for its contents, but it's the most, I think, remarkable library that we visited in terms of its space and in all of our years of researching this book.
Wow. Should we go to questions? So we have a little time. Let's do that. This one is actually from a writer we may both know, Brett Ashley Kaplan. What do you think of Nicole Krauss's imaginary Kafka in Forest Dark, which is not the first, of course, imaginary Kafka to appear in literature?
You frame the conversation, the question exactly right. The answer is I love it, and the reason I love it is that there's been a long tradition of fantasizing along the what if counterfactual history. What if Kafka had not died of tuberculosis, which is, by the way, a word that he has in Hebrew on that page in the Hebrew notebook, shachefet. What if he does not die of tuberculosis, he survives the disease and comes to Palestine in 1924? among others who fantasized about it was Max Brod, who wrote a whole novel on that theme. So in a sense, Nicole Krauss, as you rightly say, is part of a long tradition. And I love that part of the book. And I couldn't resist one day asking Eva Hoffe about it. And I said, Eva, you're very well read. Have you read this book that just came out at that time it came out in English and not in Hebrew yet? And this is the premise of the book. And she said she hadn't. And then she ended the conversation with a single line. And she said, Ach, Kafka wouldn't have lasted a day here.
Marcia Galpa asks, how was the Israeli Supreme Court's decision received by jurists and legal commentators outside of Israel?
Yeah, there's a sense in which the Germans were puzzled by something that you touched on earlier, which is that why should a court in Jerusalem have jurisdiction over this essentially a question of international cultural heritage? So there was some pushback on that. And there was one further reaction, which I think was very positive, which was there was a secondary case. Because this is a Kafka story, it's unending, right? So just last spring was the culmination of a separate trial in Stuttgart in Germany, in which German federal police had seized the warehouse of a criminal and an art forger, and among the paintings were tens of thousands of documents that had belonged to the Max Brod estate that somehow had been smuggled from Tel Aviv to Germany. And as a result of that case, they determined that must have belonged to the Max Brod estate, therefore was under the Israeli ruling. And there was a ceremony last spring where the German federal police handed that material to Avi Issacharoff, who is the Israeli ambassador in Berlin. So, it's really an unending story.
Wow. And Steve Green asks, who are the current gatekeepers in Moscow, and how does one or go about recovering Jewish literature from present day Russia?
Well, I was in Moscow, a year and a half ago to launch the Russian edition of Kafka's Last Trial. And I met with several archivists, including some who work on the famous Chabad Schneerson collection, which is a whole separate story. And they basically painted a bleak picture in this regard, which is to say that there was a very brief window after the fall of the Soviet Union where the archives loosened their grip, but that grip has since been tightened again. And there are several Jerusalem collections that are very important collections that are now in Moscow. Meirav and I had no access to them, and the same with this lost material from Dora Diamant's apartment.
A listener named FL asks, and maybe we'll close with this question. Asks a counterfactual for you to consider a counterfactual. If any of Kafka's sisters would have survived and wanted the papers, would it have changed the verdict? What might have happened? Would Brod have had to give them back, and so on?
I'm very glad that this question comes up, because actually one niece of Kafka survived, and her name was Mariana Steiner. She survived the war in London. And during the 1950s, Max Brod contacted her and said, look, I think that some of what I have actually belongs to you as the rightful heir of the Kafka family. And in fact, he sent a lot of material to Mariana Steiner, who in turn gave it to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where there's a great collection today of Kafka material for that reason. Now, Oxford was not involved in this trial, mostly for technical reasons, But I was in touch with the son of Mariana Steiner, who himself is a solicitor in London. And I think he was a bit disappointed. He had written to the Israeli court asking, to be somehow brought into the loop, and they didn't do so. And I think there was some disappointment about that. But that's important to say is that the Bodleian in Oxford has a great treasure now of Kafka material, but that too goes all the way back to Max Broad's original act of betrayal and of rescue.
I'll take the last question. You wrote these two terrific books over the course of 5 or 6 years. What are you working on now?
Well, when I was working on the Kafka book, I found out that a Jewish-Polish writer named Bruno Schulz, who was killed in 1942 by the Nazis, had, with his fiancée, translated the first Kafka into Polish. And I looked into the story, and it turns out that Bruno Schulz is considered by many in Poland today to be the Polish Kafka. And he bears certain affinities to Kafka, not in his style, but in his life. And there's a similar dispute about whether Bruno Schulz's legacy belongs in Poland because he wrote in Polish, or belongs at Yad Vashem because he was a victim of the Shoah. So somehow it's another story of disputed cultural heritage and questions of belonging.
How long do you think that book will take you?
I don't know, but I'm going to find out soon because I'm going. I just got permission, literally this week, to go to Drohobych, the hometown of Bruno Schulz, to participate in the Bruno Schulz Festival, which is around his yahrzeit on November 19th, and then I'll find out how long it'll take me. I'm sure the more that I learn, the longer the timeline will be.
Well, in the meantime, perhaps we should say you actually have a really interesting Bruno Schulz piece coming out in the next Jewish Review of Books. So before that book comes out in January, people can read your first early thoughts on Bruno Schulz. Ben Balint, this has been terrific and terrifically interesting. Thank you.